I welcome you all to the today's webinar, the Unease of Doing Digital Business in Digital India. Before we dive into the session, I would like to announce a few house rules. Today's session will be 2 hours long. The session will begin by Mr. Pradeep S. Mehta, Secretary General, Kurz International, giving the welcome address, followed by the release of the report, and Dr. Saurabh, CEO of UIDAI, giving the keynote address. After that, there'll be a presentation on the study, and which will be followed by the panel discussion. We encourage all members of the panel to keep their cameras on during the session, and please keep your microphones on mute unless you are speaking. The session is being recorded, and the video will be released later on Kurz International's YouTube channel. It is encouraged that all audience members post their questions in the chat box, and the moderator will take up the questions during the panel discussion. I now invite Mr. Pradeep S. Mehta, our Secretary General, to deliver the welcome address and start the session.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me begin by welcoming Mr. Saurabh Garg, the CEO of Aadhaar, as well as all the beautiful panelists that we have in this all-female panel, which is a very rare thing to happen. Therefore, we're very proud of it. And the Government of India is attempting to facilitate a conducive environment for doing business in India by simplifying compliances, reducing regulatory cholesterol, and decriminalizing minor offenses over a period of time due to over-enthusiasm of our polity and bureaucracy, that we often ended up in rigidifying our laws in such a way that they became very counterproductive. And much of this has happened. Much of this is even captured by initiatives such as the Business Reform Action Plan, of which we heard just the other day by Mrs. Nirmala Sitharaman, who announced the latest results of BRAP, giving a run for money to various states who were lagging behind and some states who were ahead of the others, which is, I think, a very healthy thing that we see happening. On the other hand, the company law following the Satyam scandal had become so difficult that in many cases criminalization took place, including my friends. Just to give you a narrative, a sad story, between one company and the other company under the same management, a loan was given which crossed the particular limit for which they had not sought an advance approval. I mean, it is ridiculous. Nobody was pocketing anybody's money, etc. But the poor managing director, a friend of mine, had to undergo jail for 3 days for a silly thing like this. But there was no criminal conduct. I mean, as we know, in criminal law, you have to prove there was a criminal intent, or what we call mens rea. And when there's no mens rea, even in spite of that, laws were designed in such a way. Anyway, many of this is happening, but we find that even in our present study, that in the area of digital business, there's still a lot of work to be done. Now, when we look at the digitalization scenario in India, we have, it has been pronounced by our policymakers and our leaders from time to time, including the Honorable Prime Minister, that it is a critical component for us to achieve our aspirations to become a $5 trillion or $10 trillion economy over the next few years. Now, digital businesses, and particularly digitalization, as I said, is happening so fast that even before you can bat your eyelid, some new things take place in this way. And therefore, they require respite from disproportionate and unreasonable regulations. And when I say disproportionate and unreasonable, this is often an issue which one has to address through one's mind. I'm sorry to say, but lately some of the actions by the Supreme Court itself have been so disproportionate and unreasonable that, this agitated a very large number of intelligence. But I'm just giving an example. These kind of things then have a kind of a chilling effect as well as a spillover effect in how we behave in other areas. And that is my problem. Now, digital businesses have voiced their concerns on multiple such developments. Like, as I said, the citizenry has. Now, when you get down to digital business, the amendments to the intermediary guidelines under the IT Act have caused a frenzy among digital businesses. In the past, India's move towards data localization through the RBI notification on data localization had fueled anxiety among the business community. Promoting digital technologies is important for economic growth as well as for innovation, competition, and consumer welfare. Countries around the world are attempting to leverage the opportunities that digital technologies offer to gain the economic benefits and pursue sustainable and inclusive development. Given India's capacity in technologies and a large consumer base and a very proud history, we have the potential to become a leader in the digital landscape and enhance the ease of living for millions of our population, not only our population but elsewhere in the world. In regard to India itself, I mean, several government initiatives like the UPI or the ONDC are unique innovations which haven't happened anywhere in the world and showcase the knack for innovation which India has. However, the regulatory framework for digital businesses has been complex and challenging. In this context, it becomes increasingly necessary to understand how the ease of doing business for digital businesses get impacted. A 2019 study conducted by the Tufts University on the ease of doing Tufts, TUFTS, University of Ease of Doing Digital Business, ranked different countries on the basis of how easy it was for digital businesses to operate in different jurisdictions. Unfortunately, India ranked 38 out of 42 countries in this ranking. Not much debate has happened after that, unfortunately. 2019 study. Taking the discourse forward, the CUTS initiative on the ease of doing digital business in India is an important step, a milestone to broaden the understanding and shaping the discourse around doing digital business in India. The CUTS study analyzes the existing and proposed regulations on parameters such as criminalizing provisions, regulatory uncertainty, inadequate physical and digital infrastructure, unnecessary compliances and restrictions on cross-border data flow, including mandatory data localization. I mean, a lot of these things are very, very disproportionate. They have not been very well thought about. All these issues are critical in facilitating a conducive environment for doing digital business. With the exponential growth and penetration of the digitally enabled services in our lives, the regulatory framework also needs to evolve by utilizing regulatory impact assessment to understand the costs and benefits on different stakeholders, and leveraging co-regulatory mechanisms for consumer protection, innovation, and investments in the digital ecosystem. When I say co-regulatory, what we must understand is that it has to be regulation designed by the industry to be implemented by the industrial association, and only on its failure, when a member doesn't heed its instructions, then the industry association can report the same to the government to take strong enforcement action. CUTS hopes that the study will help create a conversation among different stakeholders, including the government and the business community, about the necessity to promote the ease of doing digital business. To initiate this conversation, CUTS has organized today's discussion on the unease of doing business in digital India. Uh, we have Dr. Saurabh Garg, CEO Aadhaar UIDAI, to deliver the keynote address, which will be followed by a panel discussion. As I said earlier, two things which Dr. Garg also reminded me, why is it unease? Sounds more like a half-empty glass. I said, if you could call it difficulties uh, or the cost of doing digital business. I mean, there's so many ways to define what you wanted to say and to draw attention to it so that things become easier for uh, businesses to be able to operate this way. We have the manner. now welcome Dr. Saurabh Garg, who has been leading the Aadhaar initiative to release the report and give his expert comments on the issue. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Dr. Mehta, for inviting me for this excellent webinar that has been arranged by CUTS. I would obviously, as you mentioned, be more comfortable with the ease of doing digital business in digital India. And and I must say that this is at a very opportune time. This is the week that we are celebrating Digital India. In fact, the Honorable Prime Minister just launched the Digital India Week on Monday, the 4th of July, just a few days back. And this marked the 7 years of Digital India having been launched way back on 1st of July 2015. And it's we just took stock of where we are over the past 7 years on Digital India. And and that's the reason why I was mentioning that perhaps we need to strengthen the ease of doing digital business, but we've come a long way over the past 7 years. And one or two data points are something which I would love to share. The first being that 40% of the global digital payments that are being done, 40% are in India. So India is leading the world in terms of the number of digital payment transactions that are being done. And the numbers are so large that every second you have more than 2,000 digital transactions being done in the country. So that's the level of digital transactions that we have reached over the past few years. Along with that is the fact that we have, and this is a data point I'm taking from the Aadhaar ecosystem, we have more than 70 million Aadhaar-based transactions having per day across the country. There are some KYC is being done, or some verification or authentication is being done on a daily basis. And the JAM Trinity, I think everyone is aware of, that we have about 1.4 billion bank accounts now, and about 45 million were under the Jan Dhan Yojana for the financial inclusion. Aadhaar has reached a 1.33 billion number of enrollments that we have done. And of course, the gross mobile users in the country is now 1.77 billion. Obviously, our population is 1.3. So that's the kind of penetration of mobiles that we have. And that's what's focused on the JAM Trinity. And that's why I'm saying that perhaps globally, we've already reached a stage that we are the leaders in digital, in the digital economy. We have the target of reaching a 1 trillion digital economy over the next few years. And it's a target which some time back might have felt unrealistic, but the pace of scorching growth that we are having in the digital sector is probably gives confidence that this is something that can be achieved. I'll just like to focus on 2 or 3 points, which I'm sure would have been mentioned in the doing digital business also, in terms of how do you measure whether digital business is the indicators, so to say, of digital business. And one of them, of course, is connectivity and infrastructure. Another is payments, which I've already mentioned. And I'll just touch upon a few of these. And while this is not to say that improvements are not necessary, but this would also bring to home that perhaps we are not doing as badly as it is commonly believed on the digital side. On the infrastructure, we have reached a stage that nearly 600,000 kilometers of optical fiber has been laid under the BharatNet program, which is effectively connecting the 600,000, 6.5 lakh, 650,000 hamlets and villages that we have. So now you have the connectivity, and along with that, even if, and I mentioned already about the number of phone users, there are 1.7 billion in a population of 1.3. That's the gross number of phones. Along with that is the fact that nearly 5,500,000 common service centers or citizen service centers are there. So even if a person doesn't have a PC or a personal computer at home, there would be ready access within a few kilometers from there wherever they live. And through that citizen service center on an assisted mode, they can access the internet and be able to access government or anything else. And what is also more heartening is that we have nearly 830 million broadband users. 83 crores are the broadband users that we have. And somewhere around 780 million are the smartphones that we have in the country. So while computer penetration might be much lower, but the feature phone, the smartphone, and the broadband connectivity is extremely high, through which is what people are able to access the digital ecosystem for whatever transactions they want to do. And one other fact which I would like to mention is you have these Aadhaar-enabled payment systems, the AEPS, and you need micro ATMs to access it, so that even if there are no brick and mortar branches near the village where you stay, the fact that there are these micro ATMs and we have 55 lakh or of them across the country, which is what lends the strength for people to be able to access the bank even if there is no brick and mortar. UPI, you mentioned, we have GEM, we have the entire India stack, which is built on the digital identity, which of course Aadhaar provides, the digital rails, but whether it's the Digi Locker, whether it's the government e-marketplace, whether it's the e-Praman or the Umang apps, through which you can access different services, the number of transactions that are happening on a daily basis is only increasing. And whatever you choose to pick up, it's something which is expanding at an exponential pace. And along with this digital infrastructure and the soft infrastructure, which I would call the platforms, is also this focus on digital literacy and education. So you have the Prime Minister's Pradhan Mantri Gramin Digital Saksharta PM Disha, where nearly 4.9 crore people have already been trained. You have Diksha, which is the national platform for school education. And then you, of course, have the National Knowledge Network, which is the high-speed connectivity among the various institutions of the country. And around 1,800 have already been linked. And then you have the National Digital Education Architecture, the NDA, which is again based on that basic principle of what Aadhaar is based on, which is open technologies, open source technologies, so that we are not wedded to any vendor. It's open source. It makes it so much more stronger, I would say, because everyone has access to the source code also and strengthens it. And it also makes cybersecurity, I would say, so much easier. So that's the kind of, what should I say, the ecosystem that exists. No doubt on this issue of, you mentioned about the criminal provisions. And I think there's a concerted effort being done to decriminalize as many number of the provisions. However, while keeping in view the fact that data privacy and personal privacy issues have to be kept in view, and there might need to be certain deterrent in those areas. But the focus is on decriminalizing, on reducing the regulatory overburden, and given the fact that the digital part of the economy is disruptive in its very nature, and therefore this is something that will keep on evolving and moving forward. So the focus is there on how user consent should be prime, And data privacy has been held to be a part of right to privacy also. So while keeping in the privacy issues, decriminalization, reducing the regulatory overburden, I think these are all which the ease of doing business or the ease of doing digital business would encompass. So I'm very happy that a kind of a analysis and a stock taking has been taken. Of course, I would have been happier if this had been made mentioned as a strengthening ease of doing digital business report. But fair enough. I'm sure this unease with the title will help ensure that more effort is done so that going forward, the next report really talks of and takes stock of where we have gone forward. So once again, thank you for inviting me, and thank you and for doing it in this week of the Digital India Week, where the object of the government of being digital first, and I think that really encompasses the vision going forward, that whatever services, whatever activities that the government is doing, the citizen should be able to access it digitally as the first option. Only what cannot be accessed or cannot be done digitally should require an in-person kind of approach. So with that vision, I'm sure we are going forward and look forward for the support of all stakeholders in this. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Garg. Prince, before you come in, there's one house announcement which was not taken. That if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. Mr. Garg would leave very soon, so if you have any question to him, you could also put it in the chat box, which he will try to respond. And Mr. Garg, your comment on the title of the report is very welcome. We could put it more positively rather than negatively. That how we could improve it and so on. And that is a general philosophy which we have followed at CUTS, except that when we wanted to bring attention to this particular thing, we have kept it like this, but we still have time to, so we'll discuss it among ourselves if we need to change the title, as you suggested.
Thank you. Thank
you
so
very much. Over to you, Prince.
Thank you, Mr. Mehta. Thank you, Dr. Garg, for giving your very insightful thoughts and highlighting the things which the government is doing to promote ease of doing digital business. I will now make a presentation on the study. I'll just share my screen. So our study, Ease of Doing Digital Business, is a study on the proposed and existing regulations which are targeted specifically towards digital businesses. And we wanted to understand the factors which impact the ease of doing digital business in India. We have taken several parameters to analyze this. These parameters are criminalizing provisions, regulatory uncertainties, unnecessary compliances, as well as the inadequate digital infrastructure. So on the first parameter, which is criminalizing provisions, our study has undertaken the various frameworks which exist in different parts of the world. So we came across the framework adopted in Brazil, which is the Marco Civil da Internet of Brazil. Here, intermediaries are subject to civil liabilities instead of criminal liabilities. So here, our recommendation in the paper in the paper is that we should adopt a civil liability framework for intermediaries, and along with this, we should also repeal laws which are without safeguards, and we should also remove imprisonment provisions for minor economic offenses. Moving on to the next parameter, which is regulatory uncertainty. So here we have highlighted that why regulatory uncertainty exists, what are the different causes which make it happen, and we have highlighted that optimum regulations are the way forward. Certain things which cause regulatory uncertainty are excessive delay in enactment of regulations, or arbitrary approaches of regulators, or suboptimal regulatory designs. So we have made a few recommendations, which include formulating an overarching principles-based regulatory framework, and through that adopting a whole of government approach so that regulatory collaboration between different government departments can happen. We have also recommended institutionalizing set regulatory procedures so that arbitrary approach of regulators can be stopped. We have also recommended effectively engaging the parliament to establish accountability of regulators, because currently regulators are under the government and not and to have their independence. So we have recommended that the parliament should engage with the regulators. We have also recommended that digital businesses should be allowed to get informal guidance from the regulators as well as different government departments, so that they know that if at
Uh, I guess
am I
Prince
audible?
has been mute. Uh,
Am I
while
audible?
Pri- while Prince fixes his mic, we have a question for Dr. Garg. Uh, Dr. Garg, exclusion risks concerning and concerns regarding the limited grievance redressal around the digital payments network, which is the AEPS that you mentioned, and the digital first approach of the government have emerged. How are these being addressed in the current framework that we have? And thank you so much for joining us today, sir.
So on the exclusion part, let me just say that as of now, we've reached a point where Aadhaar, because that becomes the basis for a lot of gateway for inclusion or for access to services. We've reached a point today that 100% of adult residents in India have Aadhaar across the country. There are small pockets of some remote areas, some in Ladakh, some in Nagaland, some in Meghalaya, where enrollment was taken up later. But across the country, 100% of adults have an Aadhaar. And since Aadhaar becomes the basis for access of a lot of delivery of services, that automatically means that all of these people get included in, or when the eligibility is being analyzed or done by different departments, they all automatically get included. And on the grievance redressal, I think each department has a different system for each scheme. There is a well laid out procedure, and in each of the schemes, having different alternative grievance mechanisms is built in. It has to be there has to be an online access through a portal. Normally, there is always a kind of a phone number, a 4-digit or a 6-digit number which you can call and get accessed. These days, many of the schemes even have WhatsApp numbers or email numbers. And apart from, of course, physical walk-ins in the different offices of the state governments or the district level or at the national level. So I think, and grievance redressal is monitored at the highest levels. And there are well laid out citizen charters that lay out that whether the grievance has to be addressed within 7 days, 30 days, 90 days, depending on the kind of grievance. So I would like to assure that on both counts, both on inclusion and on grievance, sufficient focus is being given. And we would be very happy. And in fact, there's the Department of Administrative Reforms and Public Grievances who day in and day out monitor this on and look at from the social media what is the feedback that's coming in, and that becomes the input for making policy level changes. So I think this is something which is very high up on the agenda of any department or ministry, and it does get the attention that it deserves.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garg. Thank you for answering our question. I'm guessing Prince's mic has now been fixed and he can join us again.
Am I audible now?
Yes, Prince.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I was making the presentation and I had presented the regulatory uncertainty aspect. Moving on to the next issue, which is unnecessary compliances. So herein, to distinguish between necessary and unnecessary compliances, we have used a globally accepted and acclaimed framework called the regulatory glutonian framework, and we have expanded the core principles. So herein we have recommended that we need to simplify, amend, or repeal unnecessary compliances by either making a government-led central repository as a subset of the larger compliance portal, and by use of regulatory technology or RegTech to ease compliances. Further, we have also recommended to institutionalize regulatory impact assessment for lawmaking process, as well as for using the regulatory Glutonian framework for existing compliances. Furthermore, we have also recommended that we can use one in, one out concept, which wherein each time a new compliance is introduced, that compliance should be able to replace an existing or an older compliance. Moving on to the issue of inadequate digital infrastructure. Uh, in our research, we have analyzed that various initiatives and government schemes targeted towards improving the digital infrastructure in India. And we have found that though the government has taken a lot of steps, still a lot more needs to be done. So for that, we have recommended that for enhancing the digital connectivity, framework for meaningful connectivity, which means that connectivity across different social groups can happen, should be created. We have also recommended reprogramming mechanisms of internet shutdowns so that on the basis of necessity and proportionality, which was laid down by the Supreme Court in the Anuradha Bhasin judgment, so that internet, because due to internet shutdowns, businesses get impacted. We have also recommended to improve the cybersecurity protocols, and we have also recommended that the digital public infrastructure which the government is trying to create, as was mentioned by Dr. Garg, like the India Stack and Aadhaar, etc. Those should be developed through a transparent and participatory procedures so that views of all stakeholders can be taken into account. Thank you. I now hand over the session to Neelanjana.
Thank you, Prince, and hello, everyone. Good evening. Before we begin, respecting Dr. Garg's time, I just have another question for him that was sent by one of our panelists, building on the previous question. It has been some of the findings that have come out where it has been found that citizens find it hard to maneuver digital ecosystems, and there are also high transaction failures that are happening. What might be the right balance between the digitization and assisted access in India, sir?
Yeah, absolutely. As of now, we can't say that the digital ecosystem will replace the physical, and that's why I've said it's digital first, that access should be there, but not only digital. So there are 2 or 3 ways it's that is being done. One is because everyone doesn't have an equipment, either a computer or a smartphone, or is not comfortable using it. That's the reason why citizen service centers are being developed across the country. And I mentioned there are nearly 5.5 lakh of them. We have about 6.5 lakh hamlets and villages. And as of now, we have about 5.5 lakh citizen service centers across the country. There would still be some areas where it's not there. So in an assisted mode where an operator will help the resident to navigate the government systems, so that facility has been put in place and physically it's there. And a second one associated with this is the fact that the access has to be in the language, in the regional language, not only in English and Hindi. And that's why the 12 or the now 14 languages are the prime languages where all these services are being made available. But as of now, there is no such program to do away with in-person access also. And that would continue. But the fact remains that in-person access might be available at the nearest block, the nearest tehsil, or the nearest Gram Panchayat headquarter, which might be more than a few kilometers away from the nearest citizen service center. So, given the fact that the social media use is increasing, a lot of the awareness campaigns and the ISC campaigns are being done on the social media, so that people are aware on what is available and how it is available. I think there was one other point that you were mentioning linked to this is the on the transaction failures. So that's why, for example, let me just take up Aadhaar. There are reports that fingerprint failures have been reported. So we did a pilot study, and we saw that simple educating techniques to the operator have increased success rates by 10 to 12%. For example, many people put the finger vertically rather than horizontally, so that the full fingerprint is not available on the screen, or where it is to be picked up from. Just simple things like cleaning the plate where the fingerprint is taken, or cleaning the finger, has improved. And that's why we always have alternative mechanisms available. If finger, for example, for various reasons, the fingerprint doesn't work, you have an OTP. If OTP connectivity is not there, we have the iris authentication. We have introduced face authentication, which doesn't even require any other equipment. So at each point, there would be some failure mechanism available, so as to ensure that even if one methodology fails due to various reasons, and given the fact that it's a machine, and there could be machine failures or other human failures at whatever, always at each point there is more than one way of authentication that is kept. And I think that practice will continue while going forward. Thank you. I'll probably be logging off in the next few minutes. So thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Garg. And if anyone has any questions for Dr. Garg, I will be happy to receive them. Now that we have had a discussion about what are the new developments that have happened, Neelanjana, welcome everybody to this webinar on the unease of doing digital business in digital India. We have with us today a stellar panel. We have Ms. Beni, Chugh, who works with Dvara, and we also have Ms. Zainab Bawa, who co-founded Hasgeek alongside her partner. And we also have Ms. Nehaa Chaudhari, who is a partner at Ikigai Law. I welcome everybody to this panel. I would just request all panelists to please turn on their videos. Also, to limit the interactions, I would like to have multiple rounds of interactions, and to limit each session to at least 5 to 6 minutes, so that we can have multiple rounds. Also, we have a good number of panelists and participants with us today. We have some international experts on various issues, and we also have Mr. Rohit, and we had Uddhav from Mozilla with us. Thank you so much for joining in. As we listened to Dr. Garg right now, and there were multiple conversations around how India has done well for itself, how India has moved towards a better place since 2015 after Digital India campaign. While we were conducting this study, the ease of doing digital business in India, we were trying to find out what factors impact digital business in India currently. And the 4 factors that we could come out with were criminalizing provisions, were regulatory uncertainty, inadequate digital infrastructure, and also unnecessary compliances. In light of the recent developments that Dr. Garg talked about, I would request each panelist to please share with us their opening remarks in the context of what has been that distinct unease of doing digital business in India, even though there have been multiple developments that have happened in the past 7 years. Maybe we can start with you, Neha, and then.
Thanks so much, Neelanjana, and thanks so much to you and the entire team at CUTS for having me here. Lovely to be here and really looking forward to the rest of this conversation as well. I think there are several different factors that I would consider, or that in our experience we've seen from working with different clients in the digital ecosystem, that we've seen contributing to what we would what we would call today unease of doing business, and perhaps I'll talk about a few of them. And I think that we've seen several of these issues manifest themselves in different kinds of tech law and policy developments over the past couple of years. And I think that perhaps top of that list for me right now would be what kind of enforcement and liability mechanisms are we thinking about, right? We've talked a little bit earlier today about criminal liability. We've seen personal liability and responsibility manifest itself in the 2021 version of the rules as well. Similar language coming in the certain directions. We've seen that there is not in addition to this sort of criminal liability or personal responsibility, in the latest proposed amendments to the draft rules for non-compliance, there's a risk that intermediaries stand to lose safe harbor protection altogether, right? So really, I think the nature and the kind of penalties that we're thinking about for non-compliance with certain kinds of laws, and if it's possible for us to rethink that entire framework, go beyond criminal liability, look beyond personal responsibility, because I don't think in practice it really works. And we've heard this from several of our clients. The whole personal responsibility framework, I think, just ended up creating this very high stress culture within organizations as well, where it's one person who's basically on the hook for making sure that laws that basically the IT rules framework was complied with, right, among a whole bunch of other things. And I think that, just practically speaking as well, I think that's a disproportionate amount of responsibility and liability to put on somebody else. And similarly, we've been discussing internally a lot about just this idea of losing out on safe harbor protection, right? Is it possible to have different kind of frameworks? Is it possible to have fines, for example, as penalties, right? So where you're not looking at something that's so fundamental to a digital platform, say for example, safe harbor protection, and you're not sort of overturning that concept on its head as well. So I think this would sort of be top of the line for me in terms of perhaps substantive issues. I think that there's also a couple of other things on the development of the legal and policy ecosystem as well, right? One, I would say that would love to just have far more sort of laws that weren't necessarily regulation that wasn't necessarily piecemeal, with several regulators not trying to regulate the same sort of subject matter. And again, we've seen this play out time and time again, right? We've seen this, and I think some of your reports also do talk about this, right? Different, say in the e-commerce sector, for example, you already have 2 or 3 different ministries that are trying to regulate this. At the same time, we're thinking about an e-commerce policy. We're thinking potentially about an e-commerce regulator. You already have IT Act regulation. So a whole bunch of different things happening. Likewise, on data, while we're waiting for the personal data protection bill to come in, we've got different kinds of sectoral regulators coming up with their own guidances. And I think for a business, especially if you're sort of cross-cutting, right? And if you sit at the intersection of even more than one sector, it's a little complicated to be able to figure out how you're going to navigate this sort of patchwork framework of laws. And I think a related point again is one of just this kind of regulatory uncertainty, both when it comes to a little bit of opacity in the regulatory and policy development process, as well as on timelines, right? Data protection law, 4 or 5 years in the making, don't really know. We get questions every other day when what's happening with the bill. Are we likely to see it play out? Is it going to come in this session? Is it going to come in another session? And I think for a business, these are important business decisions, right? You have to think about where you're going to allocate your money into. When do you really want to start thinking about, say, for example, complying with the personal data protection law. And I don't know, I mean, I'd love a little bit more transparency in the larger system as well, right? Just knowing really what's happening with the different policies, right? At what stage are they? Is it with the line ministry? Is it with the cabinet? Has it moved on from there? Is something else happening? And I appreciate that there might be some things that aren't necessarily made public for overarching, whatever national security sovereignty reasons. But I do think that for a lot of the policies and laws that you and I are discussing today, I do think that a lot more transparency and just a lot more consultative processes would be helpful. So I'll stop with that. And yeah.
Yeah, for your opening remarks. Maybe where, as you mentioned, that there will be, it will be a good thing if we have more transparency in the laws that are being undertaken. And maybe Zainab, you can come in now. How less transparency in laws and currently the uncertainty around various industries impacts businesses, and maybe you can make your opening remarks in light of the same.
Thanks, Neelanjana. I think I'll concur with everything that Neha has mentioned and just reiterate the fact that because a lot of these policies place criminal and personal liabilities on founders and on the staff that have to be employed for compliance, like the grievance officer, this really creates a huge atmosphere of psychological pressure, which prevents a business owner from focusing on business, and rather they are concerned themselves with how do you do compliance. I think we saw this happening with GST when the new tax law was introduced, where the only way in which compliance was sort of enforced by the government was to say that if your vendor doesn't comply with paying for the GST, then you are responsible for their compliance, and that you are responsible for paying fines on behalf of them for not compliance. And I think for us as a small business, I mean, there was a lot of money that was lost in just trying to get our own vendors to comply, and finally even cutting off ties with vendors. So I think instead of creating this goal of employment generation, what seems to be happening with the current set of regulations is that it might be more lucrative for me to shut down a business and become an accountant or a lawyer, because those seem to be the roles that are more required in today's policy environment. Having said that, I think the other challenge that we are currently facing is that many of these policies are completely cut off from the ground realities of implementation. And there is very little consultation with the people who will actually have to implement these policies on the ground. So, for example, when we talk about the certain regulations, a great deal of conversation among our community really came up with the fact that what kind of workforce will have to be deployed to ensure that this compliance happens, what kind of infrastructure costs will have to be incurred in order to store these logs. And these are not questions that are being discussed on a day-to-day basis, but rather directives are thrown at you and said, now you go figure out how you're going to comply. And it's unsurprising that nobody is ready to comply on the day when these policies themselves are enforced. Similarly, with the IT rules, there is absolutely no attention paid to the fact that there are costs involved over here. And these are not just costs that have to be borne by the mining companies, but they also have to be borne, for example, by somebody who's sitting in Ratnagiri and running a medical e-commerce company, or who's running a website that sells medicines online. I mean, tomorrow, if they have some posts on their website which falls into the non-compliance bracket for IT rules, are you really going to go and give them, remove their safe harbor status and things like that? So I think there's a tremendous amount of disconnect between the implementation side and between what the policies are kind of designed to do. And I think the last remark that I want to make over here is that businesses are not being allowed to do business, and that rather there's this constant requirement for appoint this appellate committee and this grievance committee, etc., instead of leaving it to the business to figure out what is their responsibility towards their users. And as a result of that, what we're finding then is that all the laws that are intended to create good intention are resulting in people actually then just doing compliance for the sake of doing compliance. Whether there's actual privacy on the ground or not, nobody really cares, because all the people are concerned about is saying, am I going to be fined or not, and what can I do at the least minimum to be able to prevent these fines. So I think we're really not achieving much by trying to implement these kind of policies, and ultimately the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think over here the road to hell is paved with good intentions, accountants and lawyers.
Thank you so much, Zainab, for making that amazing point. Beni, what Zainab has said and what Neha has mentioned regarding the difficulties being on the ground very different from what the law is being trying to address. What do you think might be might the smaller businesses or businesses in a particular industry might be facing in making, let's say, the seamless transactions, because that was what Dr. Garg was talking about, that we through the AEPS we have been able to have the largest number of transactions in online payments. So some thoughts on that.
Yeah. Thanks. It's very hard to top what Neha and Zainab have already said. I kind of endorse everything that's been said already, but I also have a slightly, I think I have another dimension to add, which might be that ease of doing business is great and it's kind of necessary, but also ease of doing business to what end, right? So like ease of doing business for itself cannot just be an exclusive goal, but ease of doing business in a way that the sector kind of shapes up in a way that it serves the interests of both the customer and the industry. That's kind of important to kind of keep our sights on. And I think to that extent, a lot of this dissonance between what's actually on the ground and what's really happening, sitting far away from the regulator, it's hard to kind of anticipate what's going in their mind, which is where Neha's point of transparency comes in, that there should be like an open communication about issues being faced and therefore, potential solutions, some consultative kind of measures being taken, inviting comments, etc. But I think one other kind of toolkit that we are seeing increasingly to be increasingly helpful for regulators is also constant market monitoring. So these are, some people call it reg tech, some people call it market monitoring, some people call it analytics business, call it what you would, but it's the idea is that can you in real time gauge what the sentiment of the market is, both on the customer and the business side, and then kind of use that as an evidence to at least inform policy or the direction that it might take. So I think that loop, if it exists, is not very transparent to an outsider. It doesn't look like it might exist in a lot of cases. And why that might help is then a lot of concerns about who are the people who are getting affected, who are the businesses that are perhaps at a higher risk of these undesirable customer outcomes. A lot of that becomes clearer, and then you're able to take a more proportionate stance of regulation itself. And I think that evidence informing regulation is kind of, it looks like it's the missing piece right now. That's the first thing. Sorry, can I continue?
Yes.
And to my mind, the second piece then is it's great to have outcomes kind of defined in terms of reach, penetration, all of that. But we also need a more qualitative and nuanced level of outcomes as to what is the customer experience, what is the business experience. X percentage of people might be filing GST, but what was their experience of doing that is kind of important. So I think instating feedback loops is important as far as the regulator itself is concerned. And this needs to happen at all three levels, right? When you're defining the problem statement, you need to kind of deploy market monitoring to see really what the problem areas are. Then when you are coming up with a suite of solutions, then there again needs to be a consultation, what Pradeep called as co-regulation, right? There needs to be a consultation from all stakeholders involved, that would something like this make sense? And then post kind of, once you have the regulation in place, what are you doing after that? The whole responsive pyramid that we've talked about a couple of years back, the idea is that the regulator must conduct itself transparently, and the starting position should be that of good faith, right? And then you escalate gradually and proportionately. But we don't see that happening. In fact, what we hear is there would be some random leak in the media that XYZ regulator has called for information from 3 of these providers, and the entire industry, I mean, feathers get ruffled, and they're not sure what's going on, why is the information being called for, what's the agenda, what's the objective. And I think that kind of then creates fear, right? So for instance, Neha talked about personal liability. This is my last comment, and then I'll wrap up. I think we also have to kind of look a little bit beyond regulation. So much of digital has overlaps with cyber crime, and therefore a lot of law enforcement authorities get involved. So for instance, we do see cases where people running financial services get hurled up by the enforcement directorate because there was a fraud that happened using their platform, right? I mean, the provider may not even know who all are using their platform, to what extent. It's hard. It's kind of it doesn't look like it's their remit, right? But for that kind of a person to then answer to the enforcement directorate, I think there is no clear pathway as to who is escalating, whose realm is it, what is expected of the provider at that moment, what kind of information is expected of them. So I think that also then creates some amount of uncertainty that can then kind of impede business ambitions.
Thank you, Beni. And as Neha, as Beni mentioned, that can there be any way that there are crimes that are happening regarding digital businesses, and the reach of digital businesses around data and if other things is way too high. So can there be a way of coexisting with having several ways of regulating the businesses? Because I would just like to mention that maybe we are regulating a large chunk when we should be regulating smaller parts, because a lot of digital businesses are being treated with a similar lens right now. Would you agree?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And perhaps Beni is better placed to answer this than I am. I know Dvara has done work on different kinds of basically what goes into a regulatory toolkit and the different kinds of responses that you can have. But yeah, no, I think in principle, I definitely do agree. Look, I mean, personally, I'm not in favor of criminal liabilities and personal sanctions for corporate offenses at all. I mean, I don't think there is any circumstance in which I think that that is necessarily okay. It's not been something that I've ever advocated or supported. And I do think that even outside of that, it's possible to design different frameworks that look at different kinds of penalties, right? Fines being really top of them. And I also think that maybe it's possible to twist that a little bit on its head and think about incentivizing compliance as opposed to penalizing compliance, right? Because it really seems to me that whenever we're developing laws and policies here, more often than not, we tend to be the stick tends to be very, very harsh, tends to be that this is a law on an important critical issue, no doubt. And I think, and then therefore there's this very harsh penalty that comes in, or a sanction that comes in to be able to ensure compliance with that law. And I think that just fundamentally and philosophically, what that does is creates this kind of atmosphere of distrust or mistrust, where everybody then is being a little bit suspicious of each other, right? The government is being suspicious of business, the business is being suspicious of the government. And there's like what appears to be a fundamental lack of faith. Government doesn't trust that business will comply. Business doesn't trust that government will, business doesn't believe that the government will think that they're there with good intentions and good faith, and they are actually the point that Zainab was making earlier, right? Leave it to us to figure out really, it's in our best interest also to be able for us to be responsible businesses. So I think that there is, for whatever reason, this kind of trust deficit, and maybe different regulatory tools. Beni, I don't know if you want to talk about that. Could help bridge a little bit of that trust deficit as well.
Right. So as Beni and Neha both mentioned, that there can be various mechanisms that can be explored for having more and better optimal regulation that there is. Zainab, maybe would you like to come in that there is a role that exists, there is a middle ground that might be possible for having the both sides of stakeholders being in a favorable position rather than one being treated very harshly and for the sake of others' comfort or discomfort.
I think one of the things to recognize, and I think Neha hinted at that, was that what has changed really in doing business in the traditional fashion versus doing digital business. I think I want to highlight that before I can answer your question. So I come from a business family. My father's been a businessman, and I think we've seen that era of regulations in the time where it was really hard to kind of work around with the bureaucracy. But at least what you knew was from your immediate networks was that if something didn't work, then you knew who you could go to make things work. The challenge in today's era of digitally provided services and digital businesses, there's a faceless entity. Who do you actually go to if you have to get something done? I mean, I'll give an example that when I had to get Aadhaar for my daughter, because schools just simply refused to give her admission, saying that without an Aadhaar application, we cannot give the child this thing. for me, to be able to produce an Aadhaar in 7 days, I had to know the highest authority to be able to go and say, hey, I need an Aadhaar card. And the problem is not of anything else, but the fact that your people on the ground don't recognize my Aadhaar as not being an address proof. I mean, so I don't want to get into the details, but the fact is that there's so much of not translated information on the ground, and then there's this faceless entity that you have to go to be able to kind of get your grievance resolved. And if you don't have the social capital to go resolve it, then God help you. I mean, you're entirely on your own. You can try customer support for as long as you want, or you can go to any center that you want to. Nobody's really going to be able to help you. And if you're an illiterate person, then forget it. Nothing's going to kind of make sense, because ultimately what matters is how much English can you spew at this thing. So I think that's one of the things I find very appalling, that policymakers don't realize that in trying to create this digital environment, you've disempowered people at the most fundamental levels, because you've completely dented their social networks. Now, with respect to saying what's the middle ground, there's always a middle ground. I don't think that there was never a middle ground. The challenge right now is that how are people really being involved in making these policies? You issue directives on a certain date, you say there's a compliance on a certain date, and then about 4 weeks before that, you suddenly say, now we're calling a meeting in 2 days, please come to Delhi and attend this meeting. Is that the way to organize stakeholder consultations? Then you say, we will organize more stakeholder consultations, but where are the consultations? Who knows about it? If you're an inside person, you know about it. So I think the point really being is that, is there a genuine participatory approach that's being taken over here? I don't think so. I think there's a reactionary approach that's being taken over here, and larger part of it is to do with the fact that if you don't kind of respond to if you kind of don't give favorable responses, then the media will be upset, and we're all playing up to the media and saying who's the good person, who has the maximum brownie points over here. So I really think that this whole middle ground thing doesn't make any sense unless and until there's a genuine effort that's being made to say that, no, even before we pass a policy, we're going to talk to people and find out what the challenges are going to be. And you don't have to do it all by yourself. There are enough partners to kind of go out and reach out to and say, hey, can you gather us information and tell us how our policy is going to impact people on the ground. Suddenly making a policy and then saying it uniformly applies to everybody is a huge challenge. There's also a certain assumption that it seems policymakers have, which is that all people who run businesses know exactly who their users are and what is the activity going on at all time. I'm afraid that this panopticon doesn't work. I mean, it only works in books. There is no sort of there's no 360-degree 365-day sort of video surveillance cameras that all businesses have. They have absolutely no clue of who's interacting. I mean, I can report very clearly that we run a website and we just discover spam on a day-to-day basis. I mean, it's not like I know that there's somebody out there who's sitting and posting spam. So so I think this assumption needs to be broken, that as a business owner you have absolute information of everybody. I think even UIDAI doesn't have absolute information of what's going on in this country. So please forget about asking a small SME sitting in Indore or in Udaipur and saying go find out everything that your user really needs to do. And finally, the cost of compliance is something that I think genuinely policymakers have to take note of, which is to say that there can be really no middle ground if you're going to enforce and say that everybody has to have not only all information about the users, but also kind of do KYC of the users. And I think that was very appalling with the certain regulations, which is to say that now it's essentially saying that you are no longer just running a business. You have to ensure that you have all the you have full knowledge and full complete information of your customer. I mean, it's so hard for a small business to be able to comply to something like this. And so I'm saying that I think I also should sort of add a caveat over here, and this is probably the last point I'll make, which is to say that I'm not saying that you need to exempt small businesses, because there's enough of shady stuff that even goes on with small businesses, and that it's not. And I think everybody in this country needs to know how to think about privacy of their consumers and how to build more trusting businesses and ecosystems with their users. So I'm not saying that the stick has to be kind of eased out for smaller businesses, but think about what is it that you're actually trying to achieve, whether some of it can actually happen through autonomous regulation and through self-regulation, and what parts of it really need to be regulated and directed at the more granular level that we're seeing currently in the current policies.
Right. Thanks, Zainab. And Beni and Neha, I would just address what Zainab said in a small, and adding to it, I just wanted to point out that as Zainab is saying, that there is a definite miscommunication between what is the ground reality and what the government is trying to regulate. The government has started with the pre-legislative consultation process, but clearly there is still some gap in that information that is being levied. So as you were saying, Beni, that there is a lack of trust, or there needs to be trust that is developed, which was also stated in the recent judgment on IAMAI versus RBI. What other avenues can government look into other than the pre-legislative consultation process? Maybe something like a RIA or a CBA, along with starting small. So thoughts on that, Beni, and then Neha.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not a regulatory expert, but from whatever little we have looked into regulatory frameworks, there are a couple of things that help build that trust, but more importantly, kind of create transparency about the objectives of the regulator, which then kind of appeals to logic of all stakeholders, right? That this is what the regulator really wants. So I think some of those are definitely pre-consultative tools, but also, like I said, regular market monitoring. Don't want to harp on that point too long, but unless you're actually in sync with what's happening on the ground, it's very hard to kind of think that we'll be able to come up with relevant regulations. And market monitoring tools, like anyone with sophisticated grad degree in data processing, NLP, they're that easy, right? So you just have to kind of run NLP over your grievance redress mechanisms. You have to make sure that your Twitter handles are accessible for those of us who are social media savvy, for those of us who don't have that kind of reach and are kind of digitally not as forward, implanting grievance redress officers in person, making sure grievances are being collected and then being analyzed, right? So reinstating feedback loop 1, 2, and 3 is kind of helpful. So that kind of keeps you abreast with what the customer is facing and what the business is facing. Then there's this kind of a taboo around the regulator talking to, or at least used to be, the regulator talking to industry participants, which I think is quite misleading, right? Unless you are actually having a conversation with industry on what their issues are and the challenges that they are facing and the challenges that regulators are facing, there's kind of no way that you can actually reach an effective solution. So instituting mechanisms where industry stakeholder conversations become more planned and more transparent as opposed to sporadic and reactionary, the kind that Zainab was pointing to, that's also important. But also the communication itself, right? I think if the regulator over and over conducts themselves transparently, then there is an expectation of transparency that gets built, but equivalently there is a trust that gets built, right? So if there is a rule-based mechanism of escalation, if there is a rule-based mechanism of what might happen if if there are non-compliances, and those rules are seen to be followed over and over, and the logic is consistent, I think that kind of eases a lot of stakeholders. It creates trust for the customer, but equally for the business. So transparency in conduct, and I think lastly, it's like a wish list. So yeah, I could go on, but lastly, if I had to put one thing, then just better articulated policy documents, right? I mean, sometimes the objective is like digital growth of India, but that there could be like so many things that could take us to those objectives. So really articulating what objectives are we kind of eyeing for and what are the pathways, and that then kind of makes a great segue into regulatory impact assessment, which I know cuts are champions of. Don't want to preach the choir, but really kind of understanding that what are the outcomes coming at a cost of, and is it worth it? And I think those kinds of conversations become more important now because, like Neha said, businesses are now getting cross-sectoral, so they have reached beyond the immediate sector of concern, and it's important to kind of look at that kind of overarching nature of business itself before offsetting regulations in one smaller sector.
Nice. Before you answer, Neha, what Beni has right now mentioned regarding the change in the industry and businesses being multi-sectoral, there are we have a question also in the chat box from a participant that businesses don't need to be looked at in isolation. Though we might not like criminalizing provisions to be there in any aspect in the regulations, there are a few stakeholders that need to be protected, and that is whom those regulations are aimed at. So what would you, again, coming to the middle ground again, to make India go forward and forward towards its aim of reaching digital India and a digital first economy, what changes can be brought about in the current framework and how things are being done?
Was that for me?
Yes, that was true.
Yeah, got it. No, look, I mean, I agree absolutely. I don't think businesses are really the only stakeholder, but that said, I don't think just, I mean, not to belabor the point, I don't think that having personal liability and criminal sanctions, I don't think they achieve the objectives of protecting the interests of other stakeholders as well. I think that um, it's a lot of everything that we've talked about so far, right? To answer your earlier question on what changes what we'd like to see, I think we'd like to see changes in the sort of manner and process in which law and policy making is generally approached, whether it's from the inception all the way to follow through, like Beni was talking about, in terms of continuously assessing the impact, right? It's one thing to do a pre-regulatory impact assessment to be able to figure out, these are the objectives and this is how we're seeking to achieve those objectives. And now let's go on and assess really what's the impact of this going to be on every stakeholder, right? Not just the business, but everybody else, the individuals, anybody else really in the ecosystem who stands to be affected one way or another, right? Positive impact, negative impact. And I think the question of what we've struggled with, I think, with various government policies in the past few months has been there is a stated objective and nobody really has any quarrel with the stated objective, right? Even when you look at the latest sort of guidelines or any of the amendments really that came to the IT rules, sure, there are big problems that we need to solve, right? In terms of harmful content that does exist say for example on social media platforms. Again, nobody really has a quarrel with that. Nobody has a quarrel with some of the objectives that we saw mentioned in the personal data protection bill as well. I think the challenge has been one of the means that are being proposed. Do they really help you achieve the objectives that you have laid out, right? Do they really help you achieve greater accountability on business? Do they really help you achieve protecting the interests of other stakeholders in a better manner? And I think that's really where the struggle lies. Once we begin to ask that question, I think then further levels of inquiry are, okay, if not A, then can we look at B? If not B, can we look at C? And I do think that it's possible, one, to do this at every step of the way, right? You start by, and that's really what I think all three of us mean when we're thinking about designing a consultative regulatory framework. I think it's okay. In fact, we'd love, particularly when you're talking about digital businesses, when you're talking about emerging technologies, because it is evolving, right? I don't know today some of the questions and challenges that are going to come up 2 months down the line or 2 years down the line, simply because the technology is evolving as we're speaking. And I think it's okay, in fact, necessary for this to be an ongoing conversation and be like, this is where we are today. This is what's happened 6 months down the line. And perhaps we need to, revisit a little bit how we're thinking about doing these things. Now, again, like in terms of what kind of frameworks are best conducive to this happening, I think there are different models, right? It could be self-regulation, like Zainab was talking about. It could be a more co-regulatory framework. It could be sandboxes. It could be interministerial groups that are being formed. It could be that different regulators are coming together. We've seen this play out a little bit few years ago in the financial sector. So, I mean, I don't know. It could be one or more of these several different approaches. And I think that's really sort of big ticket. To me, I think it's not, I think it's far more of a structural and a process fix, because this is something that we see happening time and time again, regardless of the sector and regardless of the piece of legislation that we're talking about. I mean, like, sure, different laws and policies have their own sort of individual concerns, but I think that to solve this at scale is a structural, we should be asking the structural questions.
Point well taken. Maybe Rohit, we have Rohit with us from TQH and we would like to comment and ask him.
Hi, thank you, Neelanjana, and it's been great listening to everybody. And I think I echo everyone's sentiments, and I would just want to keep my comments very brief, starting by the fact that what Dr. Saurabh was saying initially. I think it's important to acknowledge that India has done well by setting up the digital rails and creating a lot of public digital goods and digital public infrastructure, which has actually led to a lot of growth that we are seeing currently in digital businesses. But as Beni, Neha, and Zainab were saying that somehow while the market has bloomed, I think our approach to sort of regulating that space hasn't really kept pace. So one is that I agree that regulations are sort of being imposed in an ad hoc manner, and sometimes as we see the problems we try and fix them quickly, but that's probably not the best way to go about it. And secondly, as I think Neha was also saying, there is a I personally think it's coming from a place of distrust in some cases, right? Basically you're thinking that someone is out to do wrong, and hence there's need for more compliance and regulation and criminal liability and all of that. At this point I would just like to say that as a student of economics also, that in economic theory, it's very well documented that trust and economic development go hand in hand. So economies that have better trust, they develop faster. And I think it's important that we flip the narrative that going in the default should be that you're trusting the entity. And then if something happens, you come in with certain amounts of regulation and you use that lens to lighten the load that we are kind of seeing. So that narrative, I think, needs to be flipped. And secondly, just to sort of, I do agree that the current structure, and I've read through your, quickly browsed through your report, and I think Kut's report touches on all the right things. I do think there are several examples. Criminal liability makes it difficult to also hire for businesses, right? In IT rules, everybody seems to be, there seems to be a broad brush we are using. So everybody, even smaller businesses are being burdened with regulations that should probably come in for only for SSMIs. Then I have actually been working on tokenization and e-mandate, and we've been noticing how RBI has been coming up with one regulation after the other without enough due process and consultation, and all of that is causing a lot of problems for the industry. So I think I'll just stop here and basically just say that I agree with what's being said. I think probably the intent of the government is there, but that the trust bit, I think, needs to be flipped. And if we start looking at all our regulations from that perspective, maybe we'll arrive at a system that's more conducive. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohit, for adding a new perspective to the discussion and for agreeing with what has been said until now. There has been a question that Jasmeet has asked, which is regarding ex ante regulatory impact assessment as to, and Cuts has been heavily involved in conducting said RIAs, along with having the capacity to conduct said RIAs. So would that be one of the things, because there has been so much regulation that have happened around, there are already so many regulations that exist. So do you think that it would be a good step to go forward with a ex post RIA in certain cases, because businesses are still not comfortable with all the regulations that are in place? And maybe Zainab, and after that, Beni can take it up.
Sorry, could you repeat your question?
Yes. So there are already so many regulations in place, and we usually see regulatory impact assessment before, and we usually see regulatory impact assessment post a regulation comes in. Jasmeet has asked about having an ex ante RIA in place for all the regulations. So would that be something that would be helpful for the businesses, and also a mixture of having an ex post RIA for the regulations that are already in place?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Beni, your thoughts on this? Beni, I would just.
Sorry, yeah, definitely. I think there is a need for rationalization, but I do think that we kind of need to take a step back and see that, where is this friction arising from? Like, where exactly are those air bubbles in the juxtaposition of existing regulatory framework on this digital framework? And I think a couple of things, and again, I'm leaning on my understanding of the financial sector. It might, though, spill over, and it might kind of speak to a broader trend as well. I think what we are seeing is that there is a convergence of businesses. So, I mean, like a business that was earlier just, for instance, travel booking, now also provides financial services, might also provide some other things. So businesses are kind of getting more fluid and spreading across sectors. And I think the way regulation was designed was it was directed at entities. And then there came a brief period where, we had this conversation that it's not entities, but activities, especially in the financial sector, that you should not be worried about who is doing this, but you should be worried about what is happening. So no matter who's giving out a loan, as long as it is a lending business, treat them all kind of the same. So we were just starting to gear for an activity based regulation when this kind of digital eruption happened, and we realized that people or entities that are no longer part in the remit of a particular regulator are actually entering their zone and kind of conducting business. And that was kind of it was not a proper pure play financial business either. They were providing technology support, but they were kind of very close to financial entities, which raised questions of jurisdiction for the regulator themselves, that they're tech companies, they are technically not licensed by me. Is it for me to regulate them? If so, how? So I think there's this greater convergence of businesses that's happening, and therefore regulation needs to have like a big picture principles charted out for itself. I think that's the first starting point, right? Somewhere in one of your papers, we said that we need like a vision document for digital, something similar to what the UK has, or maybe some other countries have. And I think that would be like a great starting point for all regulators to at least chart out that what is it that they're after in some amount of detail. It's easy to say customer protection and growth, but then what does that really mean? And I think once we start pulling out their objectives, we'll see that a lot of regulators are trying to achieve similar things, whereas there are other things that are kind of going unaddressed. For instance, one common plague across websites today is that of dark patterns, right? So we kind of find a pre-checked tick box, which means that I am automatically by default subscribing to something when I as a customer have not actively signed up for it. Right now, in the ecosystem that exists, there is no actually regulator, neither the Customer Protection Act have kind of provisions to safeguard a customer against it, right? So I think that we need like a proper understanding and unpacking of what's happening in the digital ecosystem, and then kind of understand that a lot of regulators have to align on common objectives, and one common regulatory framework for most part would help. I also want to kind of just caution against proportionate regulation. I know that when regulatory capacity is limited, it's kind of important to use it judiciously. But I think their digital is a bit tricky because smaller firms under the radar could actually throw up such data protection and privacy risks. I mean, perhaps Cambridge Analytica by normal standards was not a huge firm, but implications were kind of, I mean, it had the effect that it did. So maybe there's also a need for us to understand that what are the parameters that makes an entity risky, and these can no longer be the parameters that we've traditionally known of: capital, customer reach, all of those, right? I think digital works differently. It's a different species in that context, where smaller turnover companies can actually kind of inflict a larger harm. So our idea of proportionality is very much tethered to capital and to turnover and to profit and to bottom line, but maybe we need to kind of expand that definition itself, so that the law of proportionality can then be applied in a more effective manner. And then there are certain non-negotiables that I think, even if that means that small businesses have to be regulated, it's great, because I do think that one part of regulation is actually to increase friction so that customer protection can be achieved, right? So here I just want to again cite an example from financial space. So the last 2 years, we've seen that digital lending in India has been spiraling out. And once one goes deeper into that inquiry, we find that it was perhaps those NBFCs which had a smaller turnover, which were not under the direct radar of the RPI, where some of these malpractices have emerged the most. right? And there, in the regulator's defense, it was a proportionate regulation. Those NBFCs were much smaller, and therefore it was not kind of worth the regulators' while to expend so much judicious capacity, regulatory capacity on them. But we did see that they could, and they have inflicted a lot of harm. So I think there's a word of caution against proportionality. We have to make sure that customer level protections apply adequately and similarly to all entities so that there's no customer arbitrage. But then when it comes to some of those reporting requirements, some of those other compliance requirements, perhaps there is a case to be made for proportionality. So I would kind of caution against using proportionality as a go-to, because in some cases we have seen that it has fallen short.
Understood. Now that we have covered mostly around the regulatory landscape and how regulations need to do better, along with involving more and more stakeholders and in their formation, and also easing up of regulations for digital businesses, there are other than the regulations, there is still a point which remains important for digital businesses, that is a country's digital infrastructure, and what might be the constraints in accessing or having adequate digital infrastructure that a digital business might face. So this one's for the entire, for Beni, Neha and Zainab, all three, and whoever wishes to take it first can take it first maybe. That what are the infrastructure constraints that a business starting small, starting in not so tech space, such as in a city or metro city or in remote parts of India might face while it starts and while it operates currently with the available infrastructure in India for digital businesses?
I think I can mention a couple of things, and these are really what everybody's been mentioning. I think one is the general need for just a lot of awareness about all of these rules and regulations. While on the one hand, we complain and say that, these impact businesses, even businesses don't really actually go and educate themselves on what are the existing laws and policies and the upcoming ones. And so therefore there's really no scope for them to sit and even participate, because all you're trying to do as a business is to ensure that you're making money, and that money making engine is always running, because without the money you'll just be toast. So there's definitely a huge need for awareness, and that awareness also has to be non-English, because the problem that we're facing right now is that practically all regulations are in English, or at the most they will be in Hindi, but or at state levels, they might be in the regional language. But what really matters is the outreach also, and the awareness also has to be done in a non-English fashion. The other thing, and that's also come up repeatedly, is capacity building, which is to say that some of these regulations are important. I mean, ultimately, you do want to ensure that the data of your customers is secure, that you're actually doing this properly, and that your websites are not sort of leaky buckets of all kinds of malware and data. And to do that, there is a fair bit of capacity building that's required, which is before, prior to the regulation, and also that continues post, and that capacity building is currently fairly non-existent. I mean, either the businesses sort of just rely on their consultants and say that, okay, somebody will make me a WordPress website, but do we know what are the kind of insecure WordPress plugins? I mean, that's just something that either you don't know or you don't want to know, because what you're trying to do is to run the business itself rather than build the website yourself. And this is a challenge that would sort of face anybody in a 3-tier city and a 2-tier city, and it's not just a 1st-tier city problem. So I think that capacity building is sorely missing, and that's the other area that needs to be addressed. The two areas that I think are highly sort of required over here is both awareness building as well as capacity building.
Right. Neha, as Zainab mentioned, that there needs to be certain level of capacity building that happens, and there have been certain initiatives that have been taken by the government, such as the Atal Innovation Mission, which helps digital startups, and some regulations also which enable accessibility for various businesses and ask for businesses to come together with accessibility. What are your thoughts on what Zainab just said, along with how government has been taking initiatives to?
Well, I mean, I agree. I don't think I have anything else really to add to what Zainab was saying. It is a huge constraint, and I think that capacity to comply is a huge constraint, regardless of what stage of business you're at. More so if you are an MSME, right? Just the kind of compliances that we're seeing come through some of these regulations, just really what it requires. And Zainab will, speak to this better than either of us will, in her capacity as entrepreneur, because these are. There's a real money, there's a cost involved in real money terms, right? And there's a cost involved not just in terms of really what I'm spending on compliance, but there's also opportunity cost in terms of what it's keeping me away from, which is the point that Zainab, I think, one of the initial remarks that she made, right, which is, the amount of energy that I'm investing in thinking about compliance, it's energy that could be better spent elsewhere on, innovating, growing the business, doing literally 50 other things that really need to be done. So yeah, I do think that capacity is a big one. I don't think I have anything else to really add to that.
Thank you, Neha. And we have a specific question for you, Beni, that there is reducing compliances is one of the ways to support small businesses, which Neha and Zainab have mentioned. But so is the development of digital infrastructure, such as Aadhaar penetration directly being into digital services and digital finance.
I think on the digital infrastructure side, the other challenge is being able to plug into this digital infrastructure. So while we might say that there is India Stack and there is Aadhaar and there is all of this available, what is the cost to even plug into this? It's not something that's easily available to a small organization in a third-tier city. So as much as you might say that we've kind of progressed and made all this digital infrastructure available, also what is the security of that digital infrastructure? Tomorrow, if I have linked my business to doing KYC with Aadhaar, and it turns out that the database itself leaks over there, then what is the liability on me? Because clearly most of the laws currently is place a liability on the business itself rather than on another entity. And so I think that there's also a need to re-examine some of the digital infrastructure that we built for the country, in the sense of saying, how much is that being participatory in the first place? How much is feedback being taken? I mean, it's one thing to say that we will raise awareness campaigns on social media and we will take public sentiment from social media, but what is the involvement of actually going and opening a code and saying that good programmers out there, please see if our software is actually built in a manner that's safe and secure, and that the software is current. I don't see any of that happening in this country. So it's nice to say that there's digital infrastructure, but if that infrastructure is locked out, then what is the point?
Thank you, Zainab. Beni, would you like to respond to Zainab?
I completely agree with what Zainab just said, right? I mean, the big promise of digital infrastructure was quote unquote democratization and increasing participation. But if we look at it so far, I think we haven't really exactly realized that objective. It does remain very siloed, and I mean, sometimes it's for good measure, unless you can authenticate the business, you can authenticate their APIs, understand they're not getting any additional risks. But then again, there doesn't seem to be a framework that's setting all of it out, right? So there is no kind of clear way for an outsider to discern what gets you access to digital infrastructure and what doesn't. And I think that's problematic, because by definition, it's infrastructure. And I think second kind of thing is just governance of the infrastructure itself, right? I mean, it'll be interesting to see what the economics of the infrastructure is, what the long-term plan is, etc. Because some of us get worried that there's all this migration and there are all these business models that are getting developed around one infrastructure, but then what is the longevity of that infrastructure itself is kind of questionable, right? I mean, we see that when the court intervenes about Aadhaar, there's certain businesses get stopped altogether, their costs kind of increase, and then there's an amendment, etc., etc. So I think just legislative and economic certainty and dependability of infrastructure is quite important, which I think is not discussed as much as it should.
Right, Beni. So definitely, and having heard both you and Zainab, I do agree that there needs to be another look into the current infrastructure that we have. Also, with the recent news that happened that a large social media platform has sued the central government, citing disproportionate orders for removal of content. The role of government, both central and state, has been very detrimental into deciding how businesses face compliances and how businesses will function. Recently, Karnataka also put a complete ban on online gaming businesses. So what do you think states can do, and central government definitely can move towards better regulations, but what is the role of state governments towards enabling ease of doing digital business? And this one is going to be a last question. Neha, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. Look, I don't think it really differs, right? Whether you're state, whether you're center. I think the principles and the objectives and everything that we've been talking about continues to apply. It's just that given the way that our constitutional framework is, there are some things that states are, like gaming, right? Some sectors that states regulate, health, some others that the central government regulates. So I think I don't think really the bigger picture principles that we've talked about really change regardless of which government it is that we're talking about. It becomes complicated in sectors like gaming when you have different different states that are regulating the same thing in different ways. And I think that the solutions to that could be, there could be different solutions that we think about there, right? We could think about whether the central government needs to play a more active role to bring everybody on the same page, whether that's in the form of, figuring out whether there is any sort of competence or power for the center to regulate some of these sectors, to bring about more regulatory certainty, because in particularly in sectors like gaming, it's a hot mess right now, right? You have different states, you have different high courts. It's it's extremely complicated at the moment. So whether the center itself can play a more active role in regulation, or whether the center can do different things in terms of laying out model guidelines, which it then sort of works with states consultatively and urges different states to adopt. Maybe we look at sort of structures and frameworks where different states come together, work together, really figure out a model that works for really all of them, right? So the ultimately sort of giving effect and enforcing it is something that different states will do themselves, but maybe you have sort of different states coming together and sort of agreeing on really how online gaming is to be regulated in this country. Something sort of like a pipe dream. I also think that a lot of it also just comes down to again, really what kind of enforcement mechanisms you're putting in, how accessible are your entities as a regulator. We've seen in the gaming sector particularly, we've seen a lot of police action being taken against different businesses in the online gaming sector as well, justified, not justified. It's all of this again doesn't necessarily contribute to creating an environment where businesses are feeling safe and secure, that they're able to sort of run their businesses here. Again, it might help if you had some kind of predictability, right? The whole in Karnataka, all of this happened sort of very, very quickly, right? There was talk between the time that there was talk. Again, nobody really knew which way the government was thinking, which way they were leaning. They went back and forth on this a little bit, and then before you know it, you had a ban. And the kind of provisions that we saw in there, businesses had to go dark overnight practically, because it's something that came into force immediately. So again, timelines, how you're thinking about implementing, how you're thinking about enforcing some of these things. We had founders grappling with sort of real life practical questions, right? Does this mean I have to shut down my offices in the state, right? It's one thing for me to say that my app will go dark in the state, but do I also have to change my registered place of business? If I'm not allowed to do business in this particular state, what does that mean? Is it just that I can't offer my product or service in the state, or is that like I can't even have a physical sort of place of business here? Does that mean that I need to move bag and baggage? Am I going to be prosecuted tomorrow? Am I going to be arrested tomorrow because I'm running a business that sort of breaks this new law. And I think that it picks up on so many of the themes that we've talked about today. It picks up on certainty, it picks up on the kind of sanctions that you have, whether or not you should have criminal penalties. It picks up on timelines for implementation. It picks up on really questions of capacity. So yeah, I mean, definitely more complicated in some ways if it's a state subject, not because it's different when it comes to states versus the center for the things that we've talked about, but just simply because there are just so many states, right? And then the added complexity comes from then this patchwork that gets created, and then that's a whole other animal.
Thank you, Neha, for sharing this with us. On that note, since I see that we have almost finished our time, just wanted to ask everybody's closing remarks in the context of what we have discussed right now as to there needs to be more certainty, less compliance burdens, less criminalizing provisions, and more access to adequate infrastructure. Zainab, in 2 minutes, I know that you have another place to get to. So maybe in 2 minutes, you could just give us your closing remarks.
Well, I really think that Neha and Beni have added a lot to this, and I think Beni's nuances are a lot very useful to consider here. So I think I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Zainab. Beni?
I think Neha did like a stellar job of just summarizing everything. So I think what we're saying is regulation where necessary is welcome. When that happens, it must happen transparently, it must be rules based, it must be consultative. And then of course the whole kind of theme that you brought in, which is that where regulation is not necessary, what we need is rationalization, and ex post kind of RIAs are one way to determine whether regulations are serving the purpose they were designed for. I just want to kind of say that to my mind, and where I sit from, I think that any kind of regulatory impact assessment would be kind of incomplete until we also brought the customers and other stakeholders into the story, right? So it should just not be like costs of doing business versus immediate benefits, but also any spillover benefits or anything that's that can be accounted for should be accounted for, because otherwise, I mean, we'd kind of go back to the whole problem again that there's this vacuum, and then regulation would have to rush in to fill that vacuum, and it would again be a rushed context, right? So I think this ease of doing digital business is great, but ease of doing digital business towards developing like a solid market with satisfied customers and bringing that lens in kind of would make the business itself a little bit more sustainable. And I think any exercise in the isolation of customer outcomes and industry outcomes would be slightly incomplete and maybe ineffective.
Thank you, Beni, and I'm guessing Zainab has left. Thank you so much, Neha, for getting to speak with us today. With this, we can, I think, close this discussion. I now hand over the session to Prince again.
Thanks a lot, Neelanjana. I'll request Asheef, Iqubbal, my colleague, to give the closing remarks by summarizing the session. Thank you.
Good evening, all of you. I am Asheef Iqubbal, Senior Research Associate at CUTS International. First and foremost, on the behalf of CUTS International, I would like to thank all the participants and speakers. I express my appreciation to all the panelists for their valuable and insightful contribution to the important and timely discussion on the ease of doing digital business in digital India. A special gratitude and thanks to Mr. Pradeep Mehta for his opening remarks and Saurabh Garg for delivering keynote speech. To conclude, I would like to summarize key takeaways from the event. Doing digital business in India is not in sync with the ease of doing traditional business in terms of policy and regulatory changes. This is despite some of the really progressive steps taken by the government of India, including digital infrastructure such as India's stack and UPI. Digital business are not having an easy time in the current policy and regulatory environment, which is complex and challenging. There are many recent examples of where disproportionate liabilities are being imposed, including in IT rules, certain rules, and etc. It seems policy and regulation are being developed in isolations where stakeholders' views who will be responsible for implementing it are not being taken into consideration. There should be a middle ground in policy making. Policy making should be participatory, involving all stakeholders, and it needs to be more sensitive towards smaller businesses. Ground realities need to be taken into account in order to develop effective regulations. Issues faced by business and consumers should be taken into consideration periodically to ensure effective solution. Policy should not be reactionary in nature, rather than they should be institutionalized as a constructive solution for business as well as consumers. All issues highlighted in the webinar demand further discussion, and CUTS hope to engage with it and to make regulation optimal. RIA should be done to establish the alignment between aims and strategies of these policies and regulation. And my deepest gratitude goes to all who participated, and helped to make it a successful event. Looking forward to hosting all of you again and extending our engagement. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.